In 36 BC, while Octavian was fighting Sextus Pompey in Sicily and consolidating his position in the west, Antony was attempting to strengthen his position in the east. The Pompeian Parthian invasion of 40 BC had been masterfully fended off by Ventidius, but this did not mean that the threat from the east was over. For years, Antony had been planning an invasion in the east, plans which had been routinely postponed by affairs in Italy and elsewhere. At last, though, Antony was ready. In this episode, we will look at Antony's Atropatene campaign and try to understand what it was trying to achieve and how successful it was. This video was kindly sponsored by our YouTube members and patrons. Right now, the patrons and YouTube members are exclusively watching our First Punic War and Pacific War series, while the series on the history of Prussia and Italian unification wars, Risorgimento, have been concluded, and the series on the Russo-Japanese War and the Albigensian Crusade and Xenophon's Anabasis will be released next. You can join their ranks via the links in the description and pinned comment to get exclusive videos, early access to all public videos, see our schedule, get access to a special Discord server where we are very active, and much more. Thanks for supporting us, we couldn't be doing it without your help. Antony had been planning the campaign for a significant amount of time, and had in 37 BC been forced to delay the invasion in order to assist Octavian's war against Sextus, lending naval support in return for the promise of 4 of Octavian's legions. Before these promised men could arrive, however, an opportunity presented itself to Antony. Ventidius's victory over the Parthians included the death of the Parthian heir Pacorus. In 37 BC, his brother, Phraates IV, took the throne, and in order to secure his position, purged the royal court, executing many family members and nobles. Many nobles fled for their lives, and one of these, Meneses, came to Antony, informing him of the internal chaos in Parthia, and claiming that he would be able to bring much of Parthia over to Antony's side. For Antony, this was a golden opportunity. The Parthians were still recovering from the defeats suffered at the hands of Ventidius, and were seemingly fractured internally. Seizing on the opportunity, Antony put his plans into motion. Near the start of 36 BC, a lieutenant of his, Canidius, was sent to the Caucasus to guarantee the loyalty of the Armenian king, Artavasdes III, and led a rapid campaign into Iberia and Albania to secure the northern flank. Antony, meanwhile, massed his legions and prepared to attack. Phraates, however, became aware of Meneses' defection, and, likely through the use of huge bribes and promises, was able to win him back over to the Parthian side. Antony tried to capitalize on the situation by demanding the return of the Roman prisoners and eagle standards that had been lost by Crassus at Carrhae, effectively trying to turn Meneses' defection into an agreed-upon deal, but Phraates refused. This must have been a blow to Antony's strategy, but nevertheless, the Parthians still seemed vulnerable, so Antony continued with his plan. A campaign against the Parthians had supposedly been originally planned by Caesar, and preparations for this had already begun by the time he was assassinated. Having learned from Crassus's disastrous mistake at Carrhae of facing the Parthians on flat, open ground, Caesar instead intended to attack from the north into Media Atropatene, where the mountainous terrain would favour Roman legions over Parthian cavalry. Antony would follow a similar route, using Armenia as a staging ground for the invasion, and enrolling the help of Artavasdes and his thousands of cavalry, an invaluable counter to the Parthians' mobile armies. Moreover, Media Atropatene was not in fact part of the Parthian Empire proper. Instead, it was ruled by its own Median king, also called Artavasdes, who was a close ally, effectively a vassal, of the Parthians. The Median and Armenian kings were bitter enemies, so Antony was confident of Armenian support. Initially, Antony appeared to have planned to cross the Euphrates and make a dash for Armenia before the Parthian forces could react. However, when he reached the Euphrates, he found the crossing was already defended, so he was forced to take a longer route to Armenia instead. This, and the need to wait for Canidius's campaign to finish, delayed Antony. By the time all the pieces were in place, the campaign season was nearing an end, and winter was looming on the horizon. Antony had, however, always been a risk-taker. He planned to make a bold attack on the Median capital, Phraata, where the wife and children of the Median king were, and quickly take the city, presumably to use the royal family as leverage. If he moved quickly enough and all went well, there was just enough time left in the season to seize this objective before winter set in. In order to conduct the campaign, Antony had gathered a large force. There is a dispute among the sources, with his troops ranging from 13 to 18 legions, though most modern historians tend to favour a number around 16 to 18 legions. Depending on the strength of these legions, and when adding allies to the total, Antony may have had anywhere between 60 and 100,000 men, a truly colossal number, far larger than Caesar's armies used to conquer Gaul, and rivaling the size of the armies that fought at the climactic Battle of Philippi. Even without the Armenians, Antony's force included nearly 10,000 cavalry and thousands of missile troops, particularly slingers. Antony, it seems, had learned from both Crassus and Ventidius that cavalry and light infantry were crucial for fighting the Parthians, and had planned accordingly. Despite winter closing in, Antony launched his campaign. To allow his legions to move faster, he separated the slow-moving supplies and siege engines under the command of Statianus, with 2 legions and the Armenians to defend them, while he moved ahead with the majority of his force to attack Phraata. Upon reaching the city, Antony immediately launched several assaults against it, but the defences were strong and his men were repulsed. Antony began the construction of siege works and encamped his army around the city, awaiting the arrival of the siege engines. The Parthians had not, however, been idle. While Antony had been making his preparations, Phraates had managed to assemble a force of 40,000 cataphracts and horse archers to assist the Medians. These Parthians and their Median allies fell upon Statianus' force. The 2 legions left to guard the supplies and siege engines were easily wiped out, and their standards were taken. Statianus died in the fighting. The Armenians, now cut off from Antony, abandoned the campaign completely, returning home, while the Parthian Median force destroyed all of the Roman siege equipment. It was a devastating start to the campaign for the Romans. When this news reached Antony, he gathered 10 of his legions and marched quickly to try and save Statianus, leaving the rest of his army to continue the siege of Phraata. By the time he arrived, though, the fighting was long over. Antony, nevertheless, pursued the Parthians, looking to force a pitched battle. He eventually managed to find them in the field, drawing his infantry into a tight formation and having his cavalry charge whenever the Parthians drew close, followed quickly by the Roman infantry, thus chasing the Parthians from the field with the Roman cavalry in hot pursuit. Antony initially thought he had won a decisive victory, but by the end of the day, less than 100 Parthians lay dead, the vast majority easily outpacing their pursuers. Furthermore, upon returning to Phraata, he learned that the defenders had sallied out, pushing the Romans back and sabotaging some of their siege equipment. Antony was apparently so furious that he had some of the legions charged with sieging the city decimated. Antony was now in a potentially disastrous situation. With no siege engines, the siege of Phraata would drag even longer, and with winter around the corner and a Parthian army behind him, Antony's position was completely untenable. Fortunately for him, Phraates was eager for a quick conclusion to the war, likely because the winter would take its toll on his own men, and because he was looking to further secure his rule over Parthia. As a result, Phraates offered Antony very generous terms, urging Antony to simply leave Media peacefully before he lost more men to famine and winter. Antony initially tried again to request the Roman prisoners and standards from Carrhae, but was once again rebuffed. With no strength in his bargaining position, Antony's force lifted the siege, broke camp, and made for the Araxes River, the border between Media and Armenia. As he was breaking camp, a guide approached Antony, either a prisoner from Carrhae who had made it to the Roman lines, or a son of Menaces. He warned Antony that the Parthians were planning to attack while the Romans were in the open, marching back to Armenia, and urged Antony to take a different route home. The Roman general took the advice, and for 3 days, the army followed the guide, avoiding all conflict with the Parthians. On the 4th day, though, the Parthian force found them. The forces drew up for battle, the Parthians threatening to encircle the Romans. In response, Antony had his light infantry and missiles charge out from his lines and attack, the slingers and skirmishers inflicting many casualties on the Parthians, before amassing a bulk of his cavalry to charge and scatter the enemy. Antony knew that he could not afford to be bogged down, however. If the army stopped moving, he would be surrounded and likely destroyed. Instead, he formed his army into a hollow square, with light infantry and missiles on the flanks and rear, with cavalry in support. When the Parthians drew too close, the missile troops would skirmish with them, before the Roman cavalry would charge and chase the Parthians off, but not pursue them. Using these tactics, Antony was able to keep his army slowly moving towards the Araxes, with minimal losses for about 4 days. On the 5th, one of his officers, Gallus, requested a force of light infantry and cavalry to attack the Parthians and try to break the cycle. Antony agreed, and Gallus's force launched their attack. Initially they were successful, but rather than withdrawing back to the Roman lines, they attempted to press the attack. This inevitably resulted in Gallus being cut off. Antony's officers seem to have been rather reluctant to commit to the fight, only sending small reinforcement groups to try and relieve Gallus, all of which were subsequently surrounded and destroyed. Antony himself eventually had to come to Gallus's rescue with the entirety of the 3rd Legion. According to Plutarch, by the time Antony was able to intervene, 3,000 of his men lay dead and another 5,000 wounded. By this point, the Romans' lack of supplies was also starting to take its toll. The army was forced to scavenge what they could from the land, and unfamiliar with the territory, a significant number became sick after eating poisonous herbs and consuming unclean drinking water. Nevertheless, Antony was able to keep the army moving. Attacked once more by the Parthians, he had the legions form testudos and again fended the attack with light infantry and cavalry. Finally, the river was in sight, and the Romans began the process of transporting their men across. To their surprise, at least in Plutarch's telling of events, the Parthians effectively let them leave without attacking the Romans when they were at their most vulnerable, some Parthian soldiers supposedly even shouting farewells to the Romans. It had been 27 days since the army had left Phraata, with as many as 18 engagements with the Parthians being fought. The army was ragged, and despite now being in friendly territory, they were still weak and vulnerable. The Armenian winter would result in the deaths of thousands more before they could reach safety. While Antony was furious with the Armenian king for his earlier betrayal, he was currently desperate for supplies. He was in no position to force a military confrontation, and was forced to feign friendship and bide his time. The total number of casualties that Antony's army had sustained vary significantly depending on the source. Livy gives the 2 legions lost under Statianus and another 8,000 to weather. Paterculus suggests 25% of Antony's military force, Florus a third, and Plutarch approximately 45,000. The huge amount of propaganda that surrounded this campaign makes it almost impossible to distinguish the real number. At the very least, all the sources agree that Antony lost at least 2 legions and thousands more to weather and disease. While it is certainly true that Antony's losses were significant then, it is worth recognizing some of Antony's achievements. He had been forced into a very similar position to Crassus, low on supplies in hostile territory and hounded by a large Parthian force. Whereas Crassus's generalship had resulted in the complete annihilation of his army, Antony had managed to conduct an admirable fighting withdrawal and avoided the complete destruction of his force. Moreover, Plutarch, though often critical of Antony, also stresses that his men never lost faith in him, even proclaiming him imperator. A flawed man in many ways, Antony was nevertheless an excellent soldier, well liked, and excelled in seemingly disastrous situations. Without his generalship, it is possible that the entire force would have been annihilated. Antony's Atropatene campaign remains a topic of debate among modern scholars, not least because of the propaganda surrounding it. Both Antony and Octavian were masters of spin and knew the importance of controlling a narrative. In the immediate aftermath of Antony's campaign, both men pushed their own agendas, Antony claiming the campaign to be a resounding success, Octavian damning it as an abject failure, blurring the truth almost immediately. There are several sources that have survived which discuss the campaign, including Livy, Paterculus, Josephus, Frontinus, Strabo and Florus, but the most detailed accounts come from Plutarch and Cassius Dio. Neither are ideal sources. Plutarch, by his own admission, was not a historian but a biographer, while Cassius Dio was writing centuries after the events, with more of an interest in politics than military affairs, and with a distinct bias towards Augustus. Where any of these writers originally got their information regarding the campaign is an ongoing topic of debate. A participant and eyewitness of the campaign, Quintus Dellius, wrote a history of it, which is now lost and may have been used by later writers. There is, however, very little evidence to show to what extent he was used. More importantly, some very significant differences between the sources show that they were not all using Dellius and that multiple narratives were circulating. Moreover, Dellius himself had his own problems. He had fought under Antony, and so it might be thought that he would have a pro-Antony bias, but Dellius was notorious for changing sides multiple times, and wrote his history while siding with Augustus, so he may in fact have presented a damning view of Antony. In either case, he is inevitably biased. In all likelihood, some of the surviving sources were instead based on the accounts pushed by either Antony or Octavian. The extent to which they can be trusted, and therefore the extent to which Antony either failed or succeeded, is debatable. The first question we need to consider is what Antony attempted to achieve. Historian Kenneth Jones, for example, has argued that Antony was far more successful than he is usually given credit for. In his interpretation, Antony's aim was much less extravagant. He only wanted to invade Media Atropatene and force the Median king into a client-king relationship, thereby weakening Parthia indirectly and improving Antony's position in the east. This, Jones argues, is why Antony rushed for Phraata, where much of the Median royal family was. Moreover, Jones claims that the Parthians were somewhat reluctant to get heavily involved, citing as evidence the lack of an all-out Parthian attack on Antony's main force, and their allowing Antony to cross back into Armenia without attacking. The campaign was therefore largely a Roman-Median affair, with the Parthians only committing enough to defend their ally, but not enough to wipe out the Romans. The fact that Antony was claimed as imperator by his own men, and that the Median king would indeed abandon Parthia and side with Antony, are all cited as evidence that Antony was successful, even if costly, and the idea that his campaign was a failure is largely the result of Augustan propaganda. It is certainly an interesting theory, and one that should not be discarded lightly, but there are some compelling arguments against it. Sherwin-White claims that the campaign was, in fact, intended to conquer Parthia. Caesar's planned campaign against the Parthians, which Antony seems to have used as a blueprint to some extent, was due to be a campaign of conquest, and the numbers that Antony amassed were similar to those planned by Caesar. If Antony only wanted to intervene in Media, why the need for such a large army? Secondly, the lack of a major battle does not inherently imply a lack of Parthian interest. It may well have been the case that the Parthians were simply confident that enough damage could be done to the Romans without needing to risk a pitched battle. The reality is perhaps somewhere in the middle. Antony likely did plan to have a long-lasting campaign against the Parthians, starting with an intervention into Media. When the campaign began poorly, Antony mitigated his objectives, and therefore later claimed victory, having moved the goalposts. Syme's evaluation that it was a defeat but not a disaster is perhaps the fairest summary. While Antony had been defeated in the east, Octavian had finally prevailed in Sicily, chasing Sextus Pompey from the island and effectively ousting Lepidus. The last son of Pompey had fled to Militene with a few soldiers, where he awaited Antony's return from the east. Upon hearing of his defeat, Sextus tried to send messengers to the Parthians, while Antony sent a lieutenant, Titius, to offer Sextus mercy if he joined Antony, an offer that Sextus delayed responding to. Antony's officers in Asia Minor grew wary of Sextus and began maneuvering to encircle him. In a last desperate gamble, Sextus took the city of Lampsacus through treachery and pressed thousands of its citizens into his army. Using this force, Sextus attacked targets of opportunity around Ionia, eventually taking Nicaea and Nicomedia. Eventually though, Antony was able to send a proper army to confront Sextus, including 120 ships, while Sextus burnt his fleet and armed his sailors, preparing to make his last stand. The nobles that were with him, including his father-in-law Libo, though, had finally had enough. Rather than join Sextus in his desperate last stand, they defected to Antony's side. Sextus attempted to flee with his men to Armenia, but was hounded by forces under Titius, the governor of Asia Minor Furnius, and the allied king of Galatia Amyntas. Despite managing to inflict some casualties by night attacks, Sextus's supplies were cut off, and his ragtag force was stranded. His men began to desert him, and Sextus was finally left alone, and at last captured. The last son of Pompey the Great was executed months later in Militene after having fought Caesar, Antony, Octavian, and Agrippa for roughly a decade. In popular retellings of the civil wars, Sextus is often sidelined compared to the bigger players. However, it's worth bearing in mind how close Sextus had come to succeeding. In 39 BC, he was in an incredibly strong position militarily, and his blockade of Italy had effectively brought Rome to its knees. Just like his father, however, the political interests of his allies had been his undoing, and the moment had slipped through his hands. Though he was ultimately unsuccessful, one cannot help but admire his stubbornness and tenacity, and one wonders how different things would have been if Octavian did not have the fortune to have a commander as talented as Agrippa on his side. More than a decade after Caesar crossed the Rubicon, his heir and his right-hand man were the only two major players left standing. An out-and-out conflict between Antony and Octavian had been largely avoided for years, replaced by proxy wars and political maneuvering. Both men had been able to claim that they were acting in accordance with Caesar's legacy, and could legitimize their wars as being necessary for the stability of the Republic. The destruction of the last remnants of the Pompeian faction and the sidelining of Lepidus meant that, in theory, the ultimate goal of the civil war had been achieved. Caesar had been avenged, and the Republic was fully under the control of the Caesarians. In reality, though, all that had been achieved was the removal of the final buffers separating the two. The last great civil war of the Roman Republic, to decide who would be the master of Rome, loomed on the horizon. If you don't want to miss future episodes, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member-exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.